Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Connecting the Dots. Today, we'll be exploring the Electricity Act of 2023. In this episode, we aim to shed light on the Electricity Act's provisions, opportunities, challenges, and the Act's potential to shape the future of state electricity markets positively. Today, I have with me Mr. Eyo Ekpo, CEO of Excredite Consulting, and who has tremendous sector experience previously at General Electric, and prior to that was a commissioner at NERC, and prior to that was Attorney General across states. Eyo brings tremendous amounts of experience to the sector, and I believe he will have a number of things to share for the audience today. Let me hand over to Eyo to say hello.
Good afternoon to you and to all our listeners.
Excellent. So we'll quickly get into the questions and just to really understand where the market is going. So the first point I'd like to raise or ask is around the anticipated key scenarios that might unfold in the sector and the direct results of the implication of the new Electricity Act. Do you want to shed some light on that?
Yeah, the most important elements of the Act are the provisions in the Act that speak to first, kind of opening up the market for renewables and what we like to call off-grid solutions. That's one. Another is the provisions that give more authority or powers to NEC to be able to intervene in licenses, particularly, as we know, at the distribution level that are not doing well or indeed have failed. Yet another set of provisions deal with the opening up of or the redesign of the electricity sector, so to speak, in the sense that states are now enabled to establish their own domestic electricity markets, largely around distribution and generators that may or may not, as it were, be connected to the grid, but are also located within the state and are dedicated to serving local markets within the state. So you have those three sets of provisions. So the scenarios that could emerge from this are really multiple. I expect that there will be more players who would want to get into the off-grid market. I expect that there would be, at least NEC would be or should be a little bit more proactive in trying to move the market in a certain direction, particularly as we're seeing now with regards to things like NBET. But I also expect that because NEC is now asked to focus less on local electricity distribution markets and more on what you might call a wholesale market, I would like to see a scenario where NEC is consciously looking to bring more energy via the grid, both from thermal and from renewable sources. So there's potentially quite a bit of work that this new act generates for the sector, but a lot of it depends on how the regulator itself and the policymakers see what they're doing going forward and try to consciously put in policy measures, regulatory orders that get licenses in the market to behave in a certain way and enable other licenses to come into the market also. So I guess you could say it's exciting, but let's see how things unfold.
Thank you for that, Eyo. Just to follow up on that question, the way you've just defined off-grid is far different than most people in the space and out of the space would define it. So could you just go over that again so that's clear what off-grid means going forward part of the new Electricity Act?
Off-grid is simply everything that is not connected to the 330 kV, 132 kV national grid that we all know. So in simple terms, whatever kind of fuel source that you use. We tend to see off-grid as renewables and things like that, but really every entity that is licensed and is delivering energy to some buyer or customer without passing through the grid is also off-grid. So you could potentially, for example, in a state as large as maybe Niger State or Borno State or Adamawa State, create a framework that enables investors to come in and build in Niger State, for example. You could actually build another 330 kV, 132 kV grid. The state is that large and its population is that dispersed. So you might find a way to do that if it were commercially viable. So all those would be off-grid, whether at the 132 or 330 kV level or at the 11 kV, 33 kV level if you had a generator that was able to create a utility of some sort. A utility in this case being an entity that is both a generator and a distribution entity. So I know that some states have passed laws that enable their own regulators to license those kind of small entities up to a certain threshold. So Edo State, for example, can license a generator up to 20 megawatts to deliver energy through its own distribution or reticulation network within the radius that 20 megawatts would be able to serve, and it would be one single integrated utility. So all that is, would fall within the definition of off-grid. It doesn't have to be an entity that is using some kind of renewable energy source or the other. It doesn't have to be solely that.
Interesting. That's a really important point, because when people think off-grid, they think back up beyond sorts of places. So the next point I would like to explore is, you mentioned that NERC will now have less of a role at the national level, or a more concentrated efforts at the wholesale market, as opposed to what they currently are doing with the concerns of the whole federation. What strategic role do you think NERC will play in driving this effective implementation and success of the Electricity Act?
Well, in this case, we have to look at the Act again. Just like with the old Act, the Electric Power Sector Reform Act, this Electricity Act of 2023 still retains as NERC's first responsibility market design. The formula, if I remember correctly, is NERC is one of its key objectives is to put in place efficient market structures, wording to that effect, right? That's all about market design. You might say not even regulation in the classic sense. So it speaks to the fact that this is still an evolving situation that we have in Nigeria. And so how you design the market is critical. And in this regard, it's not just NERC, it's also the policymakers, because what NERC does is to design according to a certain policy precept or top-level strategic picture that is painted by the policymakers, and it is then for NERC to put flesh to that big bird's eye view that we see through the eyes of a minister or a ministry of power. So it's not just NERC alone. And if you remember Section 3 of the Act, the very first thing that the Act actually mandates is not even that NERC will regulate, but that the minister will, within a year, put in place a process for establishing a new electricity policy for the country, along with a strategic implementation plan. So those two go together, policy and then the plan, top-level strategic plan that explains to the whole world how we would like to see this new world in which we now have created by the Act evolve. So I think it's next place to work with the ministry in trying to understand what's the direction for policy, where are we going, and then begin to design, put in place regulations, orders that get licensees to behave in a certain way. Now, because you have this potential for states to establish their own markets, that obviously tells you that, like with many federal jurisdictions, your regulator at the federal level deals with the wholesale business, right? In other words, large capacity generators that are connected to a grid of some sort, right? Or a number of grids, because there's also potential now for us to have different grids, but you have these generators tied into that large grid or a number of grids, and they deliver energy to that grid, which then goes to these local jurisdictions, which are called the states. And the moment this energy arrives within the states, it becomes the responsibility where you have a state regulator for how that energy is sold. The commercial structures, the legal and regulatory structures within that state are the responsibility of the state. But up to the borders or the technical boundaries of each of these states or each of the distribution companies that cover the states, it's the responsibility of NERC how that market works. I mean, you have quite a number of examples here about how this could play out, and it's for NERC to then think through how we evolve to that in a way that also enables that is as minimally intrusive or as disruptive as possible. It's a new way of thinking. It's a new way of doing business, but it's next responsibility. Once you have clarity around policy, it's next responsibility to then put in place the rules and the regulations around which this will happen.
That's a really good point, because I think NERC originally, when this first came out, there was some naysayers saying, oh, NERC doesn't want this to happen because it'll limit their effectiveness in the sector. If you look at the act closely, you do realize that NERC's role is still very prominent in the marketplace. So it just has shifted a little bit.
Very much so, Emeka. So look, it's impossible, literally impossible. And we've seen that over the last 18 years since the first act was established in 2005. It's literally impossible for a single entity to regulate distribution at local levels from one location, right? Which is Abuja. It's just simply physically impossible. Energy is not like that. The contracts around which things should happen are not like that. So this is the reality that we need to deal with. And the fact that NERC is gradually going to have to step back from regulating distribution at local levels does not mean the end of NERC's existence.
And that's where I think a number of states are going to have their own peculiar challenges, right? Because if you look at NERC, correct me if I'm wrong, but NERC was birthed in 2007, 2006, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
NERC has probably just been very conservative, has not employed more than 1,000 people in that time period.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So you're now looking at 1,000 people, and let's discount half of those as junior staff or non-core staff. So you have about 500 people, and at least NERC currently now has a staff strength of about 250 people presently. So now you have another 250 people left that have worked at NERC or have experience with the regulator, with a number of states that are going to create agencies and create markets. These folks will not be enough. So maybe just once
Emeka, once upon a time, there was no NERC, and there was no one that knew anything about the practicality or the practical elements of electricity regulation. It wasn't a reason not to set up a NERC.
Okay.
Right?
That's a different point of view, yeah?
In 2006, 2005, the first commissioners that were appointed to NERC, none of them was a regulator or had been a regulator before, not one, right? The closest we had was the chairman, Ransom, who had been involved in regulatory affairs for an energy utility in the United States. All the experience of the power sector that we had in this country was resident inside NEPA. And so you took some people who had operating experience, but not regulatory experience, and they became regulators. And that is what we have had over the years. So I don't buy the argument about human resources being scarce. Of course, they will be scarce. There was a time when this country had how many banks? Banking was probably less than 10, 15, but tens of millions of Nigerians needed to be banked. And you had an explosion of banks, and you had people you had microbiologists becoming bankers, you had agricultural economists becoming bankers, everybody became a banker. And we learned the hard way, right? We learned by doing. That's how you learn about regulation. By the way, Emeka, there is no university that I know of that offers a bachelor's degree in electricity regulation, not one, anywhere in the world, right? Maybe at master's level and certainly at PhD level, you could do something about regulation. But what you do is that you learn the practical elements of how to regulate as a matter of continuing education. And really, that is the opportunity that we have here. So you're not going to have 36 states lining up to set up their own electricity markets overnight. It's not going to happen. The majority of states will watch to see what their typical leading states do, and then they will follow suit, right? So what's the obvious opportunity you see, Emeka? It's for developing human resources. States are going to take people from wherever it is they can find them, from NERC, from outside the country, from electricity utilities, from other fields, telecoms, wherever it is you have some form of regulatory activity going on. Because look, regulation is about what rules you put in place to constrain behavior, right, for economic efficiency. Ultimately, that's what regulation is all about. At the end of the day, how do we get people who we license to behave in a certain way so that the consumers are better served in that particular sector? That at its foundation is what regulation is all about. So you don't necessarily have to say that we can only work in the electricity sector, if we have, as regulators, if we've been in the electricity business itself, you could have regulators coming from wherever it is, but you could also train people, right? It's a professional calling, it's a vocation. So you certainly can take people from whatever field, literally, and train them. So I don't have a worry around that. And to be honest, it's not a credible argument to offer against doing things. People will make mistakes. States will make mistakes. States will enact laws that are not necessarily optimal, and there will be a reaction to those kind of laws. And what is the best reaction? You don't get people who are interested in what it is you are doing, So what then do? You learn what it is that brings people to your state, that attracts people to your state, and you do it. You understand what I'm saying? So that really is the opportunity that we have at the end of the day that we can look at and we can take advantage of.
Yeah, and I think the point I was making, and I think you made that as well, is capacity is going to be a short-run challenge, but I think it's one of those things you just have to jump in and start doing. You'll make mistakes, but you will learn and you'll move forward. The other point around what naysayers are talking about is how will states afford this market? There's so many things that states can't even afford now, from pensions to salaries to all sorts of statutory things that they're not taking care of now. So what structures do you suggest that states put in place to create the enabling environment to attract investors? I know you've alluded to some of them, but maybe if you can help us list some of those out to give states some idea on what are some of the things they could be doing now to create that enabling environment.
Emeka, I think what states need to do is less of attracting investors initially and more of putting in place the right structures, the right policy. Every investor wants certain basics, right? They want to see certain basics. They want to see simple regulation. They want to see a state that doesn't see them as initially a source of IGR, right? They want to see states that want to partner with them to be able to extend the footprint of service, to be able to, when I say the footprint of service, I mean, so you have communities that have not been served, right, ever in the state, or are served very, very, in a very spotty or, scanty way. So you want to extend regular service to those areas. And so it's more a question of states asking, what would you like us to do, right, to be able to have you come? That's one. The other thing is just getting people in place, the right kind of people who can have conversations with these investors and change perceptions about particular states. And how do you change perceptions? By engagement, by speaking the language that these potential investors understand and giving them comfort, right? That when they do come to make these investments, then of course, things will be reasonably okay. So what do? It's policy, first of all, right? It's policy, very simple. Identify your state, do the work of, putting in place some kind of plan for your state that says this is who we are, how many, this is where we are located, our communities, these are the fuel sources available. They call this kind of document an integrated resource plan, right? So spend the time to actually put this sort of thing in place. Spend the time to look for the kind of people, whether your state indigenes or other people from other states. I don't think we should be doctrinaire or rigid about this or dogmatic about it, but look for people who are willing to come to your state and talk to those caliber of people that have the capacity, the ability to invest. And, we're not looking for big things here. Every state, for example, most states, I would say probably every, but certainly most states have some kind of competitive advantage with some fuel source or the other. It's hydro, it's solar, it's thermal, right? Put that together, work with an investor, look for a 10 megawatt opportunity, a 15 megawatt opportunity. There's an investor that has gone to Ekiti. It's called Fenchurch Group. I was reading about them the other day, right? They've worked with the Ekiti state government. Many people say that the Ekiti state government doesn't have a good law. Okay, yeah, that may be the case, right? But they have gone beyond having a document, having policy, right? And they've been able to sit down with people and say, look, this is what we have. Come work with us, right? And this is what we'd like us to do. And they've done it. And so you now have an entity that is developing 10 megawatts, which wasn't there before, right? You might say it's small, but it was never there. So some community or the other in the next 9 to 12 months is going to be served by this entity, right? And that's what you want to, and that's what you want to see. Those first baby steps that show that we can actually create something end to end that is viable from generation through to distribution. And once you have that, once you can show that viability for 10 megawatts, then of course somebody wants to do another 10 and another 10 and another 10 and another 10. And all of a sudden, in the space of 18 months, 2 years, you've probably gone for most states. Most states receive energy in the high tens, low hundreds, right? 120, 110, 80, 60, 70 megawatts. So doing 10, 15, 20 is actually for many states a 30, 40% increase in energy that's available to be delivered and supplied within that state. And that's what you really want to do. So, like they say, for those of us who profess the Christian faith, we should never forget our days of small beginnings. It's those small beginnings that we need to work on, because then they lead on to bigger things.
And that's the really interesting bit about this venture that some states are about to go down, really looking at this enabling environment they need to create. One question you always get is, who will guarantee my investment at the state level? And if it's going to be the state, most state balance sheets are a mess, and I can't put my assets on there hoping that the state, if in case of default, can pay me back. What sort of structures do we put in place to ensure that even if someone wants to invest, that the state has the right instruments to attract the investor?
So we don't have credible examples of private sector-led payment guarantee structures on a large scale, but you certainly have smaller examples. So you've got InfraCredit that is working out a guarantee structure. InfraCredit is a financial intermediary whose establishment was midwifed by the Sovereign Investment Authority. So states need to, first of all, create, and we are creating, I know that is happening through the instrumentality of the NGF, a platform for exchanging know-how, right? So what can we do? How do we do it? Who do we go to? So a state would very quickly come across an InfraCredit that might be able to help work out some kind of credible guarantee scheme that has private sector financial intermediaries involved in it, not just your embed type structure, which is funded wholly 100% by the federal government. But if you can show a number of things, first, that you have a structure that makes sense, you have a regulatory framework that makes sense, you've got people who are credible in that regulatory entity, and you have a commitment to a commercial market operating structure, to contracts that are effective, however small they may be, and you then want to do a pilot, 5, 10, 12 megawatts, right, within a particular community. And InfraCredit might be able to back that, right? And they show that it works. Our people and our leaders have to, when I say our political leaders, have to be able to show, have to be able to demonstrate to our people that electricity or energy is not something that is free to air, right? Like our oxygen that we breathe. It's not something that is just there for to be given to people. It's a manufactured product, actually, the same way as the food that we eat that is cooked in our restaurant, the same way as the Coke that we drink, the water, the bottled water that we drink, the bread that we bake and eat and we buy, it's all basically the same. The end product of a manufacturing process. That's what electricity is. And it's not something that you give to people. It's something that, or at least to give across the board. You might give it in a subsidized fashion to people who are deserving, but there are always a small subset of our larger communities. But majority of us can actually afford to buy this. So it's identifying those commercial frameworks that lead from a generation entity through to a distribution entity and to a retailer or to a consumer somewhere, and showing that you can back that, right, with some kind of commercial framework. That's what the InfraCredits of this world are set up or are capable of doing, and you have to work with them as a state. You've got to have the right kind of political leadership also, right, that is focused on doing the right thing, setting in place this right structure so that they can be replicated across the state and can deliver energy to the people of the state. And I really would say you need to look at the laws that have been put in place by the likes of Lagos, but have been put in place by the likes of Edo and Enugu, and how they've set up electricity agencies whose responsibility is to target investments to those kind of communities, not just across the board, so that the cost of extending that service is reduced, And if you can then reduce that capital cost, then of course the tariff that they will have to pay in those communities is also by itself equally reduced over time.
That makes sense. I know we've talked around opportunities and the potential market for states. What are some of the challenges, some of the bottlenecks, and some of the traps that states could be advised on now to avoid in the future?
Number one is not to rush. That's the first thing. So, what does this act say? What does it expect to be done and by whom? That's the first thing. Second, you've got to engage with as states. States have to engage with the federal government and the key federal government players in this, the NCP, NEC, about having the distribution companies further decentralized. Once upon a time, we had one single entity called NEPA. Then we had a PHC, and then we had a number of distribution companies. There are now 12 of them covering every inch of the state. But distribution, of course, as we know, is a local business. So there's no reason why you shouldn't have local distribution companies covering each of the states as subsidiaries of the existing discos, right? So that's a process itself of evolution that has nothing to do with the states directly. But with the states can begin to engage the federal government to make it happen, right? Because the federal government that set up these companies and so owns them along with the co-investors. So how do we have that happen? And while you're doing that, you're also looking for human resource, training human resources. As you are training human resources, you're also working on creating a sound, or at least a sensible, a credible legal and regulatory framework, a policy framework that identifies what your state is. Like I said a while ago, what does your state want to see? How does it want to see it happen? What is the platform on which your state wants to have all this, would differ from that of a Niger state, right? The things that the Lagos state would want to see would differ from that of a Zamfara, or an Edo state would want to see would differ from that of an Enugu state in some respects. And so each of us as states have to do this homework of just trying to understand our own environment and put that out in some policy framework. And as we are doing this, you're also engaging with the federal government, like I said, about decentralizing so that you can see visible, there's line of sight from the estate capital to the distribution entity and the other licensees that are responsible for what goes on exclusively within the state. We're not talking about outsiders now. So a state has no business, for example, with a Kainji or a mainstream that runs a Kainji, or with a North-South power that runs a Shiroro, or with an NDPHC that has multiple plants. No, but the state certainly has business with an Eco Disco, a Port Harcourt Disco, or a Kaduna Disco. So you would want a Kaduna Disco to decentralize into, what states does Kaduna Disco cover? Kaduna State, Sokoto State, Kebbi State, and Zamfara State, right? That's what you would want to see a Kaduna State. So that's what the governors of those states would want to engage their local, or well, their regional disco now to be able to decentralize into these local entities. And that's a significant piece of work by itself. So there is a certain degree of simultaneity about the things that need to happen. You're engaging the federal government, you're drafting policy, you're putting a law in place, you're training people. And none of this has anything to do with energy being delivered yet, right? So by the time you've attained this level of comfort, right, about knowing your state, then you can go to NERC and say to NERC, well, I'm ready now, and I want these responsibilities for regulation to be devolved to me. As you've been doing those things, I'm pretty certain that there will be entrepreneurs, investors that will be keeping an eye on what you are doing. I will be saying to you, well, we're ready to work with you. For me, it's a given that when you have governors, when you have state policymakers that are doing the right things, they will, in the natural course of events, attract people who will come to them and say, look, we want to be able to engage with your state at this level to be able to get involved in this budding electricity market of yours. But again, you've got to start. And there will be some of those that would start. I know that Enugu is doing something. I know that Edo is doing something. I know that states like Lagos are doing things, or your state is doing things, Ekiti State, Ondo State, Kaduna State, Taraba State, Adamawa State. These are states that actually want to sit down and think through, and are thinking through what it is they would make of the opportunity that they have. And, today, it's still, in many cases, an early start, but I'm pretty sure that in 9, 10, 12 months, there will be significant activity that would have been carried out, and you should begin to see some, little shoots of success showing up here and there.
Thank you, Eyo. You've been very insightful, and also your knowledge of the space is clear. we've marked 10 years of post-privatization earlier this month.
Mm-hmm.
It is the hope and it is the dream that in the next 10 years, the number of hours of supply would have drastically improved or is not at 24 hours. And the
Mm-hmm.
number of people who are off grid would have also reduced drastically because right now their numbers around 85 million Nigerians don't have access to the grid. So hopefully these state markets will then enable some of this work in those spaces because as you said, it's much easier to handle an Anambra market when you're local there rather than when you sit in Abuja or elsewhere. So I'm really looking forward to some positive steps on the state market, but I believe we've made the right decision to try something new because what we've been doing for the past 10 years has not been effective to say the least. Any last words, sir?
No, I agree with you. It's just that I wouldn't get hung up on off grid, on grid. We just want people to be served. And we don't really care where our energy comes from. I don't care whether my energy originally showed up through Egbin, for example, or through mainstream in Jeba or Kainji. I don't care whether it started out from Malawi. It doesn't matter to me. I just want it to be delivered. And that's really all we want, as people. And that's really what I think our policymakers, our state governors, our federal authorities should really focus on, and a lot less on who controls what, who has this power or that power. It's really ultimately about delivering energy to people in the best way that we can, the most efficient way that we can, and to do that in a way that enables all of us to be a lot more productive, and to be part of that value chain that is created between being able to identify some kind of fuel source or the other, whether it's hydro or thermal or renewable or whatever it is, and deliver it to some generator and have it sent by whatever means to people, whether it's through the grid or through a local distribution network directly. But as long as it gets to people and we can use that and enhance our socioeconomic engagement, it's a huge win for us. So that really is my own last take. We have to be a lot more collaborative. We've got to think through the things that actually work for us. We've got to identify the things that have challenged us: capitalization, how we govern, how we adhere to our contracts, how we run our companies, how we deploy funding. If we think through all these challenges, we'll come up with solutions. And if we come up with solutions, we should just try and implement them and be more collaborative, more cooperative, and less antagonistic to one another.
I think if we look at where the market is, the best place we can go is up because we've been stuck in this 4,000 number for so long, and the amount of diesel and fuel generators have increased, which for a country that's aiming to hit net zero by 2060 is not a good approach. So I'm really hoping that the state market will be at least part of the solution. Thank you so much, Eyo, for your time, and we look forward to speaking to you again in the future.
Thank you, Emeka. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Connecting the Dots. You can find more episodes on our social media handle The Next Year on Facebook, LinkedIn, X, and Instagram. We also have a number of other media reports and other sector reports that you can feel free to browse. Thank you and have a good day.